Lonely Rancher saved a wounded Lakota girl, but 50 warriors showed up. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to subscribe and like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The wind pressed against the cabin walls as if it meant to tear them apart. Boards groaned, shutters rattled, and the old stovepipe whistled with each breath of the storm. He had grown used to such nights, to the endless white swallowing the valley, but tonight carried something else. A sound. Faint, broken, almost smothered beneath the roar of the gale. He set down the tin cup in his hand and listened. Not the crack of ice or the cry of a coyote. This was different. Human. Weak but persistent, dragging itself across the dark. His jaw tightened. He reached for the rifle propped near the door, a worn but reliable .50 caliber he hadn't fired in weeks, and unlatched the wooden bar. The storm met him like a fist of needles. Snow stung his face, blurred the world into a shifting wall of white. He stepped off the porch, boots crunching through ice-crusted earth, and strained his eyes. There, barely visible against the snow, a shape moved, inch by inch, like a shadow trying to become real. He trudged forward, each step a battle against the gale. The closer he came, the clearer the truth. Not an animal, not a fallen branch. A person, small, frail, collapsing between each desperate crawl. When he dropped to one knee beside the figure, his breath caught. A girl, young, far too young to be alone in this wasteland. Her skin was ash pale, lips cracked with blood, one eye swollen near shut. Rawhide bound her wrists so tight the flesh had split. Her dress, thin, torn and soaked, clung to her ribs where bruises bloomed black and purple. Whoever had left her here had not meant for her to survive the night. He scanned the tree line, listening past the storm for hoofbeats, voices, anything. Nothing but the relentless scream of the wind. Whoever had done this was gone, or clever enough to vanish into the white. The smart choice would be to turn back, close the door, forget what he'd seen. Survival often demanded blindness. And yet, his fingers brushed the girl's collar, where a simple beaded strand peeked through the torn fabric. Knots uneven, colors mismatched, the kind of work done not for beauty, but for love. He felt his chest tighten. He had made one just like it once, for a boy with straw-colored hair and a smile too wide for his face. A boy now buried beneath 6 winters of regret. The storm howled louder, urging him to leave. But his boots were already planted in the snow, his rifle slung back over his shoulder. He slipped his arms beneath the girl's body, lifting her as gently as he could. She weighed less than a sack of grain, her breath shallow but still there. "Easy now," he muttered against the wind. "I've got you." The cabin's lantern glowed faintly through the blizzard. He pressed forward, each step heavier than the last. The door slammed shut behind them, muffling the storm, but not the burden he had carried inside. The cabin swallowed them in dim lamplight and the faint smell of smoke. He set her down on the rough-hewn table he usually used for skinning deer. It was the only flat space big enough to hold a body. The wood creaked beneath her slight weight. For a long moment he just stood over her, rifle leaning against the wall, breath still heavy from the storm. Her skin was like ice beneath his calloused fingers. He yanked a wool blanket from his cot, wrapped it around her shoulders, then crouched close to the stove. Sparks leapt as he stoked the fire back to life, feeding it kindling until the orange glow spread across the room. Heat filled the air, but not fast enough for the girl. He pulled out a dented tin basin, filled it with snow, and set it near the stove to melt. The medical kit came next, dragged from beneath the floorboards where he kept it hidden with other things he'd hoped never to use again. Morphine, carbolic acid, needles, thread. Memories he'd tried to bury with his son. Her dress had frozen to the blood along her ribs. He soaked the fabric until it loosened, then peeled it away inch by inch. His jaw clenched. Deep bruises marred her side. Rawhide cuts scored her wrists. Her shoulder bulged awkwardly, clearly dislocated. And then he saw the mark. A burn seared into the flesh just below her collarbone, shaped like a crude cross. Not tribal, not ceremonial. Punishment. Torture. The basin water was warm now. He dipped a rag, cleaned the wound as gently as he could. She flinched even in her unconsciousness. He pressed his palm against her forehead. A fever already smoldered. Time was short. He slid her shoulder back into place with a sharp, practiced motion. The sound made his stomach twist, but it had to be done. He worked at the bindings on her wrists, slicing carefully through rawhide, then rubbing salve into the angry grooves left behind. Her hands might never be whole again, but at least they were free. He forced a few spoonfuls of broth between her lips. Most dribbled out, but some went down. She stirred, eyelids fluttering, then slipped back into darkness. He sat back, chest aching. For 6 years he had told himself he was done with people, done with saving anyone but himself. Yet here he was, with a half-dead stranger wrapped in his last blanket, bleeding on his table. The storm outside moaned against the walls, louder than before, as if the world itself disapproved. He looked at the girl again. She was too young to carry such wounds, too young to be left to die alone in the snow. His gaze drifted to the photograph above the mantel. Faded, edges curled, a boy with straw-blonde hair grinning wide, gap-toothed. Micah, his son. Gone before his time, gone because help had come too late. The man's throat tightened. He dragged a chair close to the table, rifle leaning within reach. He would sit through the night, watch her breaths rise and fall, and if death tried to claw its way in, it would have to come through him first. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, the fire whispered. Between them, he waited, a man who had sworn he'd never open his door again until tonight. To continue this adventure, please subscribe to our channel. It helps us keep creating. The storm had not let up by morning. Snow pressed against the shutters like a siege, rattling the panes, muting the world to white silence. Inside, the fire in the stove had burned low, embers pulsing faintly like the last beat of a tired heart. He crouched, feeding it more wood, then turned back to the girl. She hadn't moved much since he carried her in. Her breaths came shallow, rattling, each one sounding as though it might be her last. The blanket had slipped from her shoulders, exposing the bruises that bloomed across her ribs. He drew closer, sleeves rolled to the elbow, basin of warm water ready. The first task was her shoulder. The joint bulged at a grotesque angle. He pressed his palm to it, muttered a quiet curse, and forced it back with a sharp motion. The crack echoed in the small cabin. She twitched violently, lips parting in a faint gasp, then stilled again. His hands trembled afterward, though he told himself it was only the cold. Next, her wrists. He cut away the rawhide bindings, careful not to slice skin. The grooves were deep, angry red, some already turning purple with infection. He rubbed salve into the wounds, fingers working the ointment into torn flesh. They would scar. She might never regain full feeling in her hands. He kept working anyway, jaw set, as if by sheer will he could undo what had been done. When he shifted her slightly, he noticed the dark stain near her collar. He soaked the cloth, peeling it back slow. Beneath the blood-crusted fabric was a mark burned into the skin. A brand, harsh and ugly, seared in the shape of a crooked cross. His stomach tightened. This wasn't tribal. This wasn't ceremonial. This was punishment. Deliberate cruelty meant to strip her of dignity before stealing her life. He sat back on the stool, breath heavy. Whoever had done this hadn't just wanted her gone. They'd wanted her broken. Reaching for clean bandages, he felt something stiff beneath her torn dress seam. A small leather pouch, soaked but still intact, was stitched into the lining. He tugged it free. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a scrap of parchment and a brass button.
The button gleamed even in weak light. U.S. Army issue. He unfolded the parchment. A map drawn by hand, lines crooked but purposeful. Rivers, ridgelines, notations in a mix of Lakota script and broken English. Circles marked with X's. Some places carried names he recognized: old mills, logging depots, even a fort. At the top corner, faint pencil words scratched across: "Delivered to Bledsoe, trade for gold." His pulse quickened. He had met a Captain Bledsoe once, years back. A soldier with a handshake too firm, eyes too hungry. If this map was tied to him, then this girl had not simply stumbled into his valley. She had been carrying something worth killing over. The girl stirred faintly, lips moving, but no sound came. He folded the map back into the pouch, slid it beneath the floorboard where his medical kit had been. Then he sat still, staring at the storm-blurred window. This was no accident. The storm had carried her to his door, but men had carried her to the edge of death, and men would come again. By mid-afternoon, the fever had taken hold. Her skin glistened with sweat, damp strands of hair plastered to her brow. He wrung out a cloth in cool water, dabbed her face, muttering words he hadn't spoken in years, half comfort, half prayer. Her lips moved, faint at first, then clearer. He leaned closer. "Taku." Her voice rasped raw, syllables broken. He recognized enough to know it was Lakota. Father. His chest tightened. She was drifting between worlds, clinging to fragments of memory. "Hush now," he said softly, pressing the cloth to her temple. "Save your strength." But her eyes fluttered open, clouded yet piercing. For a heartbeat, she seemed to see him. Not the cabin, not the storm, but the man. She swallowed hard, coughed, then forced words past cracked lips. "They shot him." He froze. "My father." He stood, no weapon, said peace. "They shot him at the council." The weight of her words pressed like a stone on his chest. He had heard rumors of such councils, treaties written with one hand while the other reached for the trigger. She coughed again, a violent spasm that left specks of blood on the blanket. He steadied her, raised her head enough for a sip of broth. She drank 2 swallows, then pushed his hand away. Her strength surprised him. "They said he resisted. Lies." She closed her eyes, trembling. "Before he gave me this." Her fingers fumbled toward her chest, clutching at the pendant strung around her neck. A carved eagle feather, worn smooth with time. "Said if he fell, I must carry the truth." Elias swallowed, throat dry. "The map?" he asked quietly. Her eyes flicked open, a flash of fear and recognition. "You found it?" He nodded once. "You don't understand," she whispered. "It's proof, names, places, the trade. If I die, the truth dies too." The wind battered the cabin walls as if to underscore her words. He pulled the chair closer, leaning forward, voice low. "Then why bring it here? Why not run farther?" She studied him, pupils sharp even through fever. He said, "Find someone with honor, someone who still remembers." Her gaze lingered on him longer than he liked, as though she could see past the stubble, the scars, the silence he had built around himself. "I didn't know where else to go." For a long time he said nothing, staring into the fire. Honor. It was a word he had buried with his son, a word that cut sharper than any blade now. Finally he spoke, voice rough. "What's your name?" She hesitated, then answered with the weight of heritage. "Wana, daughter of Tashunka Luta, Red Horse." The name hit him like a blow. He had heard it whispered in saloons, in hushed talk between scouts and settlers alike. Red Horse, the last Lakota chief who believed peace with the army was still possible. Rumor said he had been murdered at a council just weeks ago. And now his daughter lay in Elias's cabin, carrying the very map that could prove it.
She closed her eyes again, whispering one last word before slipping back into fevered sleep. Truth. The storm broke by the next morning, leaving the valley buried beneath a sheet of white so clean it almost looked innocent. Elias knew better. Snow hid tracks, erased signs of struggle, made it easier for wolves, human or otherwise, to move unseen. He had just finished binding Wana's shoulder again when the sound reached him. Hoofbeats. Not distant, but close, muffled by the snow, yet steady, deliberate. His hand froze on the knot, then reached for the rifle leaning against the wall. Through the narrow window he saw them, 3 riders, dark coats against the blinding snow, carbines strapped across their saddles. The lead man wore a cavalry hat tipped low, a star badge glinting on his chest. Government issue. Trouble. A knock came, sharp against the wooden frame. Elias opened the door just enough to block their view inside. The cold rushed in, stinging his face. "Mornin'," the lead rider said, voice too casual. "Sorry to trouble you. Name's Sergeant Cooper, Fort Carter Detachment." His smile was narrow, his eyes sharper. "We're looking for a runaway. Girl, brown hair, young, slipped the line 3 nights back." Elias let the silence hang before answering. "Ain't seen anyone." Cooper's smile didn't fade. "Long storm out here. Easy for folks to get lost. Mind if we take a look around? Just routine." Elias shifted, the door still firm in his grasp. "I do mind." His voice carried the edge of a man used to being left alone. One of the troopers behind Cooper nudged his horse, gaze fixed on the chimney where smoke curled faintly upward. The other studied the boots by the door, mud still fresh on the soles. Cooper kept smiling, but the edges of it strained. "We don't mean offense, just making sure the wrong folks don't freeze to death out here." Elias leaned on the door, eyes steady. "Plenty of snow out there for you to search, none inside." For a moment the air crackled with unspoken challenge. Then Cooper tipped his hat, slow, deliberate. "Fair enough. Appreciate your hospitality." They turned their horses, snow crunching beneath iron shoes. Elias didn't breathe until they crested the ridge and disappeared from sight. But he'd seen the way one of them lingered, eyes darting toward the cabin before riding off. Inside, Wana stirred weakly. Her lips parted. "Soldiers?" He set the rifle back against the wall. "Not anymore, but they'll be back." She shivered, clutching the blanket tighter. "They won't stop." He knew she was right. The map, the button, the brand on her skin, it all pointed to something bigger than a runaway, something the army itself wanted buried. He stoked the fire, but the warmth did little to chase off the chill crawling up his spine. Out there, beyond the trees, men in uniform were hunting. And now, whether he liked it or not, they had his scent. The valley went quiet after sundown, too quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Elias sat near the stove, rifle across his knees, listening to the crackle of the fire and the faint rasp of Wana's breathing from the cot. Each sound outside, the snap of ice, the shift of branches, set his nerves on edge. They hadn't ridden out here just to tip their hats and leave. He knew soldiers, knew the look in their eyes when they smelled prey. They'd be back, and when they came, they wouldn't knock. He had prepared as best he could. Snares stretched low across the yard, hidden beneath snow. Powder horn rigged with a fuse near the porch steps. A lantern filled with kerosene tucked into the pig pen. Old tricks from older wars. The first shot came just past midnight. A sharp crack split the air. Wood splintered near the window frame. Elias dropped low, dragging the rifle up to his shoulder. Another shot followed, closer, punching through the shutters. Boots crunched over snow outside. Voices, hushed but urgent. He counted at least 6. "Move fast," one barked. "The girl's inside." Elias's jaw clenched.
They weren't even pretending anymore. He slid along the floor to the far wall, lined up through a gap in the boards, and fired. A shadowed figure pitched backward into the snow with a grunt. The yard erupted in chaos. One soldier lunged toward the porch, only to trigger the tripwire. Metal jaws snapped shut with a sickening crunch, his scream cutting through the night. The other shouted, ducking behind the woodpile in the chicken coop. Elias crawled toward the door, flung the lantern into the pen. Flames leapt skyward, orange light flooding the yard, throwing shadows wild across the snow. He fired again, clipping another man in the leg. The soldier howled, falling into the drift. They returned fire, bullets hammering the cabin walls. Splinters rained down. Wana stirred on the cot, eyes wide with terror. "Stay down," Elias barked. He reloaded fast, muscles moving with old rhythm he thought he'd forgotten. Another soldier rushed the porch. Elias dropped from the roof ladder he'd nailed earlier, landing behind him, and drove the butt of his rifle into the man's skull. The soldier collapsed in a heap, snow turning dark beneath him. For a heartbeat, the yard fell still, smoke rising from the burning pen, firelight glinting off steel and ice. 4 bodies lay scattered, moaning or silent. The survivors hesitated, fear creeping into their voices. "Fall back!" someone shouted. Boots pounded retreat into the tree line. Silence returned, broken only by the crackle of fire and the hiss of snow melting against it. Elias stood in the wreckage, chest heaving. His cabin, his refuge, was riddled with bullet holes, its walls scarred. He looked back at Wana, pale but alive, watching him with wide eyes. Not a burden, not a stranger, someone's daughter, someone who deserved more than to die nameless in the snow. He wiped blood from his brow, lifted his rifle again, and whispered into the flames, "Not on my watch." The yard still reeked of gunpowder and charred straw when dawn broke. Blackened snow marked where the pen had burned, and bodies lay stiff in the frost. Elias dragged them one by one to the far edge of the tree line, leaving them where the wolves would find them before the sun climbed high. He kept only one alive, wrists bound tight with rope, moaning in and out of consciousness. The others were beyond saving, beyond questioning. By the time he returned to the cabin, exhaustion weighed on him heavier than any wound. Wana watched from the cot, her voice a whisper. "They'll come again." He didn't argue. She was right. He stoked the stove, but his eyes kept drifting toward the ridge behind the cabin. 6 soldiers had come in the night. Next time, it would be more, maybe dozens. He had fought wars before, and he knew what happened when one side felt mocked. They came back with fire and fury. He couldn't do this alone, not anymore. From the bottom drawer of an old chest, he pulled out a bundle wrapped in oilskin. Inside lay flint, dry moss, and cedar twigs bound in red thread. His fingers hesitated, then worked quickly, as if muscle memory guided them. It had been years since he'd sent a smoke signal. Not since the Dakota campaign of '66, when men like him had hunted men like Ashen. Ashen, a tracker, once conscripted, later deserter. They had crossed paths in blood and betrayal. Last he heard, Ashen had returned to his people, taking a place among the northern bands. Whether he still lived, Elias couldn't know, but he had no other choice. He climbed the ridge behind the cabin, the wind biting his face raw. Snow crunched underfoot, carrying him higher until the valley spread wide below. He built the small tower of moss and twigs, struck flint, coaxed flame into smoke. Thick black plumes rose into the sky, curling upward against the pale winter light. 2 columns, a pause, then one more. The old code, danger, urgent, friend in need. He watched the smoke drift, praying silently to no one in particular. By sunset, the column had thinned, blending into the gray sky. For a time, he wondered if it had gone unanswered. Then he saw it, far to the north, faint but certain.
Another plume, rising, glowing orange at its base. A signal in reply. Ashen had seen. Relief struck him hard, followed just as quickly by unease. If Ashen was coming, so were others. That meant hope, but also danger. If the army caught wind of Lakota bands moving this way, they'd respond with more than a handful of soldiers. He descended the ridge slowly, boots crunching in the fading light. At the cabin, Wana was sitting upright, pale but steady, her eyes fixed on him. "You called him," she said, more statement than question. He nodded. "If anyone still remembers the old codes, it's Ashen." Her gaze softened, and for the first time since he'd found her in the snow, she almost smiled. "Then we're not alone." Elias glanced toward the horizon, where smoke still faintly marked the northern sky. His grip tightened on the rifle slung across his back. "No," he said quietly, "but neither are they." By morning, the valley had turned ghostly white again. Fresh snow fell soft and silent, covering the blood-stained drifts, hiding the scars of the night before. It was as though the land itself tried to forget what had happened. Elias knew better. Some wounds never closed. He stood at the window, rifle leaning against the frame, eyes scanning the ridge. No riders yet, no columns of smoke, but the silence pressed heavy, unnatural. He had seen it before, quiet before the storm. The cabin no longer felt like shelter. Bullet holes pocked the walls, smoke stains scarred the ceiling, and every creak of the boards whispered of fragility. They couldn't stay, not another night. He turned to Wana. She lay propped against the cot, bandages stained but clean, fever eased for now. Her gaze followed him as he moved through the room, pulling gear from hidden places, satchel, canteen, cartridges, the old compass he hadn't touched in years. "You're leaving," she said, her voice rasped but steady. "We're leaving," he corrected. Her brow furrowed. "Fort Carter is death." "Maybe," he admitted, sliding bullets into the rifle's chamber. "But it's also the only way the truth walks out of this valley alive." He knelt beside the hearth, pried up the floorboard, and pulled out the leather pouch. Inside, the hand-drawn map and the army button gleamed faintly in the firelight. He held them for a long moment, the weight of what they meant pressing into his palm. Proof of betrayal. A death warrant in paper and brass. Then he set them in the satchel and reached for a photograph tucked into the corner of the trunk. The image was faded, edges curled from years of handling. A boy with straw-blonde hair, grin wide, teeth gapped. Micah. His throat tightened as he slipped the photo carefully into the satchel alongside the map. "You died waiting for medicine," he murmured under his breath. "Maybe I can make it mean something now." Wana watched in silence, eyes glistening with something more than fever. He lashed together a sled from spare boards, covering it with canvas and every blanket he owned. When it was done, he tested the rig with the old bay mare. The horse stamped and snorted, uneasy with the weight, but it held. Snow still fell as he stepped outside, the valley muted beneath the gray sky. On the far ridge, smoke curled faintly. The signal he had sent now echoed again. Ashen was coming, but so, Elias knew, were the soldiers. He led the mare to the door, checked the rifle one last time, and slung the satchel across his shoulder. Inside, Wana struggled to sit, her voice trembling but firm. "Why do this? You could still walk away." He met her gaze, weathered eyes steady. "I tried walking away 6 years ago. Didn't work." She said nothing more as he lifted her gently into the sled, tucking blankets around her fragile frame. Her eyes closed, but her hand clutched the pendant at her neck like a tether. Elias tightened the harness, glanced once more at the cabin, the place that had been both prison and sanctuary. Then he turned the mare toward the south, toward Fort Carter, and clicked his tongue. The sled lurched forward, cutting a fresh trail through the snow. The storm had not ended, it had only changed shape. The journey to explore the Wild West is still long. Subscribe to hear more true stories. If you're still watching, drop a 1 in the comments. The gates of Fort Carter loomed like gallows against the pale winter sun. Timber walls rose stark and unwelcoming, topped with guards whose rifles caught the light like sharpened teeth. Elias rode slow, shoulders square, hat pulled low. Behind him the sled bumped along, Wana hidden beneath canvas and silence. A sentry's voice rang out. "Name and business?" Elias raised one hand in calm salute, slipping into the lie he had rehearsed since dawn. Elijah Duncan, envoy from the Cheyenne Land Board. Papers to deliver. His tone carried the steady drawl of a man too tired to bluff. Murmurs rippled along the wall. A young corporal climbed down, taking the folded parchment Elias handed over. The ink was still damp, the seal real enough, lifted from a dead clerk buried in Kansas years ago. The corporal frowned, lips moving as he read, then shrugged. "They're expecting someone. Could be him." The gates groaned open. Elias nudged the mare forward, heart thundering. Once inside, there'd be no turning back. Fort Carter smelled of sweat, smoke, and discipline. Barracks stood in rows, mud-stained and orderly. Wagons creaked beneath the weight of crates. Soldiers marched in practice drills, boots striking dirt with hollow rhythm. To the untrained eye, it was just another army post. To Elias, every detail screamed wrong. 2 guards posted at the northern warehouse, too stiff for routine. A wagon loaded with crates marked grain, yet lifted too heavy for food. And there, men carrying boxes whose stenciled markings had been smeared over with black pitch. Elias's jaw tightened. Smugglers in uniform. He guided the mare toward the stables, choosing the farthest stall cloaked in shadow. Wana stirred faintly beneath the canvas, her breath shallow but steady. He leaned close, whispering, "Stay quiet, I'll be back before frost sets in." Her eyes flickered open, trusting, or maybe only resigned. He straightened, slipping the satchel over his shoulder.
The map, the button, Micah's faded photograph, all pressed against his chest with the weight of judgment. Every step from here was a gamble. Moving between barracks, he kept to shadows, the rhythm of boots and barked orders covering the crunch of his own. He passed soldiers playing cards, one eye always scanning. He saw a lieutenant pause mid-stride, suspicion flaring before duty pulled him elsewhere. At the north end of the fort, the warehouse loomed, timber dark, hinges rusted, guarded like a shrine. Elias didn't move toward the door. Instead, he circled wide, eyes searching for weakness. A loose plank near the foundation, just enough. He crouched low, running calloused fingers over the seam. The night would hide him better, but time was already bleeding away. If he waited, Bledsoe's men might move the crates again, bury the truth deeper. He glanced back once toward the stables, where Wana lay hidden. Then he pressed the knife against the plank, pried it open with slow, careful force. The wood groaned, snowflakes drifting in as he slipped into the dark belly of the warehouse. The air inside smelled of oil, iron, and secrets. The point of no return had arrived. Darkness swallowed him whole. The air inside the warehouse was colder than the yard, heavy with the tang of gun oil and old wood. Elias struck a match, shielding the flicker with his palm. The flame licked shadows across stacked crates. He pried open the nearest box. Inside, rows of repeating rifles gleamed, wrapped in oiled cloth. Not standard issue, new, foreign steel. He pulled another crate open, finding cartridges packed tight, enough to arm a small war band. Beneath them, bags of coin clinked faintly. He lifted one, spilling a handful into his palm. The markings were not American, Prussian mint. His jaw clenched. This wasn't just smuggling. This was treason. At the far corner, a ledger lay open on a crate, pages marked with neat columns of ink. He flipped through quickly, eyes scanning. Names, coordinates, shipments, transactions signed with the flourish of Captain Everett Bledsoe himself. Delivery confirmed, 400 rifles, paid in buffalo hides and mineral rights. His breath grew shallow. This wasn't corruption confined to one man. It was a network, sprawling and deliberate, feeding gold and guns into the frontier at the cost of peace. He tore a page free, the seal stamped in gold wax. It slid into his satchel alongside the map. If he lived long enough to show it, the truth could burn down the fort. The match guttered out. A sound behind him, boot leather scraping wood. He froze, pulse hammering. Slowly, he turned. 3 soldiers stood in the gloom, rifles raised. Behind them, the guard from outside pushed through the plank gap he thought hidden. "Well, well," one muttered, voice sharp with triumph. "Looks like we caught ourselves a rat." Elias reached for his rifle, but the butt of a carbine slammed into his back. Pain shot white-hot as he staggered forward, air driven from his lungs. Rough hands stripped the satchel from him, tossing it to the ground. "Search him!" They wrenched the papers free, holding up the stolen ledger page. The soldier's eyes widened, then narrowed. "Captain's going to want a word." 2 men grabbed Elias under the arms, dragging him out into the cold night. His boots scraped the dirt, body heavy but spirit defiant. He kept his jaw tight, refusing to give them the satisfaction of groaning. They hauled him across the parade ground, past lines of curious soldiers who whispered behind gloved hands. Some glanced at him with suspicion, others with unease, as if they already knew too much. The holding pit waited at the rear of the barracks. A square hole dug deep, timber walls slick with frost, no roof, only the stars above. They shoved him in, the fall jarring every bone. The grate slammed shut. Elias lay there, breath ragged, staring at the night sky. He had found the proof, but now he was caged, beaten, and marked for death. Above him, boots marched away, leaving only silence. The storm was inside the fort now, and he was at its center. The night dragged long in the pit. Elias sat with his back to the frozen wall, every muscle aching from the blows. His breath steamed in the air, his thoughts circling the same bitter truth. He had carried the evidence this far, only to lose it at the threshold. Bootsteps broke the silence, slow, deliberate. Elias lifted his head. Captain Everett Bledsoe stood above the grate, a lantern in one hand. The light carved his face into hard planes, the scar down his cheek gleaming like white fire. His coat was pressed sharp, brass buttons gleaming, as if he had dressed for ceremony. "You should have stayed in your valley, McKenna," Bledsoe drawled, his voice calm as a sermon. "But I suppose rats always crawl toward the grain." Elias didn't answer. He would not give him the satisfaction. Bledsoe crouched, setting the lantern so its glow poured through the grate, illuminating the bruises across Elias's face. "You think you've uncovered something grand? A ledger, a coin, a few crates of rifles? That's nothing. The world is built on trade. Blood for gold, peace for land, always has been." His tone hardened. "You just had the misfortune to notice." Elias spat blood into the dirt. "You murdered chiefs under flags of peace, sold your own honor for coin. That's not trade, Captain. That's rot." A shadow flickered across Bledsoe's eyes, but his smile held. "Honor doesn't feed soldiers. Honor doesn't build railroads or fill the coffers in Washington. Gold does, and I intend to collect my share." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "You won't live to tell anyone. Tomorrow, at noon, this garrison will watch you fall. They'll see what happens to men who consort with savages and traitors." Elias's jaw tightened. He thought of Wana hidden somewhere in this fort, of the map now in enemy hands, of Micah's photograph pressed against his chest.
The execution wasn't about punishment. It was about erasing him, erasing truth. "Make it quick, then," Elias muttered. Bledsoe's smile widened, sharp as a blade. "Oh no, quick is mercy. You'll be tied to the post in front of every soldier here. They'll fire on my command, and they'll know your death was their lesson. That's the kind of memory that keeps men in line." For a long moment, neither spoke. The lantern crackled faintly. Snow drifted across the open grate above. Finally, Bledsoe straightened, brushing frost from his gloves. "At dawn, they'll drag you out. At noon, you'll be gone. Sleep well, McKenna. It's the last peace you'll ever get." He lifted the lantern and walked away, boots fading into silence. Elias leaned his head back against the wall, eyes on the stars. His body ached, but his spirit would not bend. He whispered a prayer, not for himself, but for the girl, for the truth, for one last chance to make his death count. The cold seeped deep into his bones, but his heart burned steady. Noon would come, and with it a reckoning. The noon sun burned sharp and unforgiving, bleaching the parade ground into blinding white. Elias stood bound at the post, wrists raw from rope, coat torn from the night's beating. Around him, the soldiers of Fort Carter gathered in tight rows, muskets gleaming, faces drawn. Some looked eager, others uneasy, but all had been ordered to watch. Captain Bledsoe strutted before them, every inch the officer. His voice carried across the yard, polished like a speech rehearsed in front of mirrors. "Let this be a warning," he declared, eyes sweeping the ranks, "to spies, to traitors, to those who consort with savages. This man dared defy the authority of the United States Army. Today his life ends, so that order may endure." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Elias kept his chin high, jaw tight. He would not give them the image of a broken man. The firing squad stepped into place, rifles raised, sunlight flashing along their barrels. And then, hoofbeats, dozens of them, every head turned toward the northern ridge. A dust cloud rose against the bright horizon, and out of it came riders, 40 strong, Lakota warriors, their faces painted with solemn marks of mourning. At their lead rode Standing Bear, broad-shouldered, eagle feathers streaming from his mantle. But there were no war cries, no weapons drawn. Instead, they carried a white flag stretched across buffalo hide, tattered but unmistakable. A silence deeper than fear fell over the yard. Bledsoe's face blanched. "Raise arms," he barked. "Sound the alarm!" But Standing Bear had already dismounted, planting his feet firm in the dust. He raised one hand, palm outward. Behind him, the others followed, dismounting, walking forward, slow and deliberate. "This is not war," Standing Bear said, his English rough but steady. "This is a funeral." He turned, his voice carrying like a drumbeat. "For those your men slaughtered under flags of peace." One by one, his people began to speak names. Lakota chiefs, elders, leaders, men who had walked into councils with open hands and been cut down under white banners. Each name struck like a bell, echoing across the yard. The soldiers shifted uneasily. Some lowered their rifles without being told. "This man you would kill," Standing Bear said, gesturing toward Elias. "He carries no war in his hands. He carries truth. If you silence him, you bury what is already blood on your own soil." The execution ground was no longer an arena for Bledsoe's power. It had become a memorial, every name spoken, another stone laid on his conscience. Bledsoe's voice cracked as he shouted, "This is rebellion! This is sedition!" But the words rang hollow. Elias stood straighter at the post, a strange calm settling over him. He had walked into death's shadow expecting silence, but now the yard trembled with voices that refused to be silenced. The tide had shifted. The question was whether it would break the dam or drown them all. The yard was hushed, held in the strange stillness between fury and revelation. Standing Bear's voice faded, the names of the dead still hanging like smoke in the cold air. Soldiers shifted, no longer so quick to raise their rifles. Bledsoe's jaw worked furiously, but even he seemed to feel the ground slipping beneath him. Then another voice broke the silence. My father's name was Tashunka Luta. All eyes turned. From the edge of the crowd, Wana stepped forward, wrapped in Elias's old wool coat, her arm bound tight with rough linen. Her steps were unsteady, but her back was straight, her gaze fixed not on the soldiers, but on Bledsoe. She carried 3 things: a scorched map, a worn leather pouch, and the beaded necklace still stained with dried blood. Elias felt his chest tighten. He had begged God she would stay hidden, but here she was, walking into the fire. My father came to your counsel, Wana said, her voice trembling but unbroken. He carried no rifle, no knife. He carried hope, and you shot him. Gasps rippled through the ranks. She held the map aloft, the parchment quivering in her hand. This shows where the bodies lie, where rifles were hidden, where men in blue coats traded honor for gold. Murmurs rose louder. Soldiers exchanged glances, some with shame, others with disbelief. Next, she lifted the necklace, the small beads glinting in the sunlight. This was in his hand when he fell, a gift from the man who still believed peace was possible. She turned her eyes to Elias, and for a heartbeat the yard felt smaller, bound by that single connection between them. Finally, she drew a folded paper from the pouch. Its edges were frayed, the ink smeared with age and blood. This is his will, his words written so the truth would not die with him. Her voice broke once, then steadied as she began to read aloud. The words were simple, unadorned, but carried the weight of a people betrayed. A plea for trust, a record of treachery, and the names of those who had taken bribes to trade peace for profit. Among them, Everett Bledsoe. The crowd stirred, anger swelling, confusion rippling through the neat lines of soldiers. One man muttered, "I didn't sign up for this." Another dropped his rifle to the dirt. Bledsoe's face twisted with fury. "She lies," he barked. "They all lie. This is trickery, meant to shame the army." But no one moved to silence her. Wana stepped closer, voice cutting through the chaos. "If I die, the truth still lives. If you kill him," she gestured toward Elias, "you kill honor itself." The soldiers stood suspended, their loyalty pulled taut between duty and conscience. Elias, bound to the post, felt the shift in the air. A crack had opened in the wall of obedience, and through that crack the truth was flooding in. The yard quivered with unrest. Soldiers whispered in tight clusters, rifles lowering inch by inch. Wana's words still hung in the air like a thunderclap, every syllable chipping away at obedience. Bledsoe felt it. His composure cracked, fury twisting his scarred face. He shoved past his own men, eyes blazing, and strode toward Elias. "You think words can save you, rancher?" His voice shook, not with fear, but with rage. "Let's see if truth stops a bullet." In a flash, he pulled his revolver from beneath his coat, the polished steel glinting in the noon sun. Gasps rippled through the ranks. Some soldiers half raised their rifles, uncertain whether to protect or obey. Elias stood bound, unflinching, eyes locked on his executioner. He had waited for death before, but never like this, never with the world holding its breath. The hammer clicked back. And then Wana moved. She stepped forward faster than anyone thought her battered body could carry her. From the folds of Elias's wool coat, her hand darted, flashing bone and leather. A small Lakota throwing blade, hidden since the night she crawled into his cabin. She hurled it with desperate precision. The blade struck true, burying itself in Bledsoe's hand just as his finger tightened on the trigger. The revolver clattered to the dirt, harmless. A roar of shock surged through the yard. Bledsoe staggered back, clutching his bleeding palm, eyes wide with disbelief. "You little—" He never finished. Elias surged forward with a strength he thought long buried. Rope snapped against his wrists as he drove his fist straight into Bledsoe's jaw. The crack echoed across the parade ground, and the captain collapsed into the dust like a toppled idol. Silence held for a single breath. Then a voice rang out. Private Harlan, barely a man, freckles stark against his pale skin. "What do we do now?" A grizzled sergeant stepped forward, ripped the insignia from Bledsoe's coat, and tossed it into the dirt. "We start by disarming the liar." Two men seized the captain by the arms, dragging him upright as he thrashed and spat. "You fools! You're finished! Washington won't forgive this!" "No," Elias said, standing tall despite the blood and bruises. His voice was low, steady, the kind of voice that carried further than a shout. "You had a choice, Captain. You sold your honor for gold. Now you'll answer for it." Wana stepped beside him, her eyes blazing. "You killed my father, but the truth didn't die with him. It stands here." One by one, soldiers lowered their heads, not in shame, but in solemn recognition. A rifle clattered to the ground, then another. Soon the entire courtyard was filled with the sound of steel surrendering to conscience. Bledsoe's screams turned hoarse as he was dragged away. His authority had shattered, not with a war cry, but with the weight of truth. Elias exhaled slowly, the fire in his chest easing. The noose of death had loosened, but the cost was written everywhere. In blood, in betrayal, in the faces of men who had finally seen too much. The storm had broken, and nothing in Fort Carter would ever be the same. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. And please leave a comment and share your feelings. Fort Carter did not crumble in a single day, but its heart was broken the moment the captain fell. In the weeks that followed, the barracks emptied of order. Soldiers once drilled to obey now spoke in hushed tones of truth and betrayal. Rifles went silent, flags were lowered. By the time word reached Washington, the fort was no longer a bastion of authority. It was a hollow shell, walls standing but spirit gone. Captain Everett Bledsoe was stripped of his command and hauled east in chains, spitting fury all the way. "This won't stand! You'll all hang!" he cried, but no one listened. In Washington, his trial would be another story, one that Elias had no intention of seeing. The man's punishment could never equal the lives already burned by his greed. Elias didn't go back to Red Creek. His cabin, his solitude, the ashes of his son, they no longer belonged to him. Instead, he stayed on the land between the broken walls of Fort Carter and the hunting grounds of the Lakota. It was a valley scarred by war, but wide enough for something new. They built it simple. No walls, no guard towers, no registry for bloodlines. Just a single wooden building with 2 doors, one facing east toward the settlers, the other facing west toward the sacred hills. Inside, there was always a fire, clean beds of hay and cotton, herbs strung from the rafters. It became known as the healing post. At first, few came. A Lakota mother with a fevered child, a ranch hand with a broken arm, a soldier, ashamed but desperate, asking for treatment under cover of night. Each left lighter than they came, their wounds tended without question. Word spread, not through newspapers or proclamations, but through whispers carried on the wind. Wana never left his side. After the hearings, after her testimony burned holes in the army's silence, many thought she would return to her people. But she chose the valley. She brewed salves from roots Elias had never seen, taught him to read the trees for sickness, to calm a horse with touch alone. In turn, he taught her English, not just words but books. She favored Dickinson's poetry and Lincoln's speeches, though she laughed at their long-winded metaphors. They were not lovers. That would have cheapened what they became. They were survivors, two souls bound not by passion, but by a covenant of survival, of truth carried forward. Elias called her daughter once by mistake. She did not correct him. The healing post grew. Settlers came from far ranches, Lakota hunters from the plains. No weapons crossed its threshold. People left tokens when they came, broken spurs, carved feathers, letters never sent. Elias kept them all, not to collect, but to remember. One night, as winter pressed hard and the fire crackled low, Wana asked him, "Do you ever miss being alone?" Elias watched the flames for a long time before answering, "No, I used to think silence was peace, but I was just afraid of being heard." She nodded, her gaze steady. "Now you are." Elias smiled faintly. "Now I am." The valley carried their names differently. To some, she was the daughter of Red Horse, the last truth-bearer of a broken treaty. To others, he was Uncle White Wolf, the weary soldier who built something whole from what was shattered. Neither corrected the stories, because the stories were not about them. They were about the line they refused to defend any longer, the line that became a bridge. Years passed, seasons turned, snow giving way to grass, storms yielding to calm. The healing post never grew taller, never claimed the grandeur of a fort or a town. It remained what it was from the beginning. Wood worn smooth by time, two doors open to all who needed them, and a fire that never died. Elias grew older, his shoulders stooped, but his hands steady. He tended to ranch children burning with fever, to Lakota hunters caught in traps, to soldiers who slipped away from their regiments in shame. Wana brewed medicines that smelled of cedar and sage, carved driftwood animals to hang above the door. She taught children to listen to the wind, to hear stories in the trees. Some scoffed at the post. Ranchers called it folly, warriors called it naive. Yet none could deny the power of what they saw. Enemies sharing bread, strangers tending one another's wounds. The valley softened. Hatred did not vanish, but for a few hours within those walls it lost its grip. One day a boy came alone, no older than 10, carrying his little sister slung across his back. Her skin was hot with fever, her lips cracked from thirst. Their family wagon had been burned, their parents gone. The boy had walked 2 days through snow, guided only by whispers. "They said you'd care," he told Elias at the door. Elias took the girl into his arms, laying her near the fire, and Wana began her work. The boy sat watching, too tired to cry, until Elias set a hand on his shoulder and said, "You're safe here." Later that week, Elias carved a sign from the last board of his old ranch gate. He worked 3 days, his knife slow but sure, and when he was done, he hung it high above the doorway. The words were plain, not fancy, but they carried more weight than brass or banners. "This is a place where no one asks the color of your skin, only how deep your wound is, and whether you want it healed." People came just to read those words. Some removed their hats, others wept silently. A Lakota elder, bent with age, stood before the sign and said, "This place will outlive you both." He was right. Years later, when Elias's breath slowed and Wakana's hair silvered, the healing post did not falter. The fire was kept by others, some settlers, some Lakota, some wanderers who had once found shelter there.
They carried forward the rituals, lanterns lit at dusk, herbs drying from the rafters, tokens left behind to honor the wounds of the past. Children grew up calling Elias Uncle White Wolf, though his bones rested beneath the valley grass. Wana's carvings hung above every door, reminders of the hands that shaped them. Her teachings lingered in the soil, in the roots and medicines that healed long after her own heart stilled. The wars did not end. Lines on maps kept shifting, and hatred found new homes. But the healing post remained, stubborn as stone, a witness against forgetting. Travelers whispered its story far beyond the plains, of a soldier broken by grief, of a girl carrying her father's truth, of a place where wounds were mended without questions of allegiance. Some called it myth, others called it mercy. But those who walked through its doors knew better. History does not always change with battles or treaties. Sometimes it bends in the quiet of a snowbound night, when one man chooses not to look away. Elias McKenna had not been born a hero. He was only a weary soul with scars no one could see. But when truth crawled bleeding to his door, he opened it. And in that choice, a bridge was built that no storm could wash away. The story of Elias and Wana is more than a tale of rifles and betrayals. It is a reminder that the hardest choices are often the quietest ones. In every life, there comes a night when the world feels cold, when it seems easier to close the door and turn away. Elias did not, and because of that, truth lived on. Perhaps you have faced moments like this in your own life, times when compassion cost something, when mercy asked for courage. These stories are not just about the frontier. They are about us, about the fragile bridges we build between grief and hope, between strangers who choose to see one another as human first. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs reminding that kindness still matters. Subscribe and join us as we uncover more true Wild West stories, tales of courage, choice, and the humanity that outlives every storm.